What is going on, everybody? It is the Vanishing Mediators, the big Signorelli, aka Andrew, and I'm here with Maximilian Costa, our wonderful third member. Unfortunately, Nick is not with us today, but in his absence, his signifier remains present. So it's kind of weird doing this because we're used to having either all three of us, or in the past before Max it was just Nick and I, but now it just feels weird having two people when there should be a somebody filling in the placeholder of the third.
Yes. Today we form just an imaginary duality.
Yeah. Which we'll be talking about, because today
Yes,
we're going to be
exactly.
going over uh in Seminar 3, the psychoses from 1955 to 1956. We're going over two chapters, 12 and 13, which tie in together as Lacan or Jacques-Alain Miller titles this the hysterics question. So the first one, chapter 12, lecture 12, is just called the hysterics question. And then 13 is the part 2, the sequel on what is a woman. So Max will have the floor for the first part, and then I will give my piece for the second part.
So, the hysterics question. In this chapter, Lacan addresses three questions, in my opinion. First of all, what is the signifier and what is it not? Secondly, what is analysis and what is it not? And thirdly, what is the question? What is the hysterics question? But let's start with the first. What is the signifier and what is it not? It's not a sign, it's not a trace, it's the signifier. Why is this question important? Lacan says it's important because every analytic phenomenon, every phenomenon that comes from the analytic field, from the analytic discovery, from what we are dealing with in symptoms and neurosis, is structured like a language. And being structured like a language means being structured by the signifier. Let's start with what is not. It's not a sign, but what is a sign? The example Lacan uses is that of the red-breasted robin. And the sign here, of course, is the red breast. What does it refer to? It refers to this red robin being a legitimate, a fertile sexual partner, because this red is especially intense in males. And basically, it refers to itself in some sense, because this red breast is part of this legitimate sexual partner. So in the sign, there is an equivalence of thing and meaning, and there's no ambivalence of meaning. And another typical example, I think, is the smoke and the fire. So the smoke is the sign of the fire, but it's also part of that fire. And there's no big ambivalence of meaning there. The important thing is that the referent of the sign is a present substantial thing. So with the fire is definitely present, and it's a substantial thing. And the same is with the robin. It is present. Now, what about the trace? The example that Lacan uses for the trace are the footprints that Robinson Crusoe discovers on the beach on the island where he is stranded. And these footsteps are later on confirmed to be that of a man he will call Friday. The trace here are the footprints, and the referent of these footprints is, of course, this man, Friday. Now, the important thing is, again, like with the sign, it's a substantial thing that is referred to, but the special thing about the trace is that this thing is absent, and the traces mark the absence of this referent. So for example, a referent of a fire, I guess, would be like ashes on the ground, for example. And this is important, this absence. Lacan says the trace in its negative aspect draws the natural sign to a limit at which it becomes evanescent. The distinction between sign and object is quite clear here, since the trace is precisely what the object leaves behind once it has gone off somewhere else. So the referent is absent. And this is also reoccurring in the signifier in some sense, because the signifier is a sign that also refers to something that is absent, but not a substantial thing, rather another sign. So the signifier marks the absence of another signifier, and it doesn't refer to a thing or an experience, but it refers to another sign. That's what Lacan is also basically saying in this quote here. And yeah, he says, the signifier is a sign that doesn't refer to any object, not even to one in the form of a trace, even though the trace nevertheless heralds the signifier's essential feature. It too is the sign of an absence. But insofar as it forms part of language, the signifier is a sign which refers to another sign, which is as such structured to signify the absence of another sign. In other words, to be opposed to it in a couple. So there are kind of three terms that are really important here. There's the signifier, then there is another signifier, and this other signifier signifies the absence of yet another sign, basically another signifier then. As we talked about last time, the signifier in itself has a kind of difference because it refers to its own absence. So that's the one signifier. And then when another signifier appears here, opposed to it in a couple, this other signifier stands in for the absence of the first. And this absence of the first is then displaced onto this other signifier. That's what he's saying, like this other signifier is structured to signify the absence of yet another signifier. Maybe I'm a little bit too fast in that, but I'm pretty sure later on in the seminar, he's going to name these operations of displacement and substitution, metaphor and metonymy. I'm not sure if he did that before. I'm pretty sure it's the first in this seminar. Yeah, and the example that he used, and we talked also about this last time, is the example of day. And day doesn't refer to any experience, as he says, it refers to its own absence as a signifier. And that's a kind of question, first of all, this absence. So what represents the absence of day? What is it differentiated from, if we like talk in Saussurean language? This absence is then represented by another signifier that stands in for this absence. So the presence of day only subsists through signifying its own absence in not being day, not being night. And this lack, this symbolic lack, is displaced onto night then. So I'm saying that because you can also express this in numbers, and that's what Lacan is doing. This symbolic lack is basically a -1 that's continuously displaced through the symbolic chain. And I really like the example he used, that this -1 is really what is important in analysis, because you're important in analysis insofar that it is linguistic, because other approaches that disregard the signifier, they don't have this -1. And because like if you divide up an object as many times as you want, you can do that, you're never going to get a negative value. So if you don't operate with this -1, you're not including the essential feature in analysis, because what this -1 is in essence the unconscious, and everything else is conscious or pre-conscious. So that becomes even clearer why this -1 is so important if we go to the next question: what is analysis? And here now in this part, I'm gonna propose my controversial idea. So what is analysis? In the beginning of this chapter, he's referring to that by speaking about the relation between S and O, which is interfered by the imaginary circuit between ego and little other, so O and the other O. And the important thing is that between this S and O, there's the passing of full speech, or like he says in Seminar II, the analysis must aim at the passage of true speech, joining the subject to another subject on the other side of the wall of language. So what is analysis? It is the passing of full speech, of true speech, which takes place between this S and the O. But my question was, while I was reading this chapter, was again, what really is full speech? What is true speech? What is that all about? And why is it being interrupted by this imaginary circuit, by this wall of language? He kind of talks about this a little bit, I think, in this section, also from the beginning of this chapter, in which he says, I simply want to indicate to you that the word to be understood, with the emphasis that this comprises the solution to an enigma, a problematic function, is located in the other through the intermediary of which all full speech is realized. This you are, in which the subject locates himself and recognizes himself. Well, this makes me think that the passing of full speech has to do with a recognition in the big other, recognizing oneself in relation to some kind of word. And this, of course, has to be seen in contrast or in opposition to the méconnaissance, to the misrecognition of oneself in the little other. And to me, this méconnaissance could very much be equated with the understanding that we have been talking about already before. And that understanding cannot be anything else, like this is on the beginning of Seminar III. To me, it is this méconnaissance, this, you are just like me, I understand you, right? That's opposed to the recognition in the big other, which is described in Seminar I to have nothing to do with understanding, but rather to do with ignorance, because ignorance structures the analytic situation. And the positive fruit of the revelation of ignorance is non-knowledge, which is not a negation of knowledge, but rather its most elaborate form. So on the one side, we have understanding of some kind of content. And on the other hand, we have ignorance, which leads to a specific kind of non-knowledge that has to do with this passing of true speech. All that leads me to believe that in essence, what is true speech, what is full speech, what has to be passed on in analysis is basically a primordial signifier that is at the root of the symptom. And what is such a primordial signifier? It is basically a signifier that signifies nothing except the lack of another signifier, of a meaning to arrive, right? So it signifies nothing but some kind of non-knowledge. So there is nothing to be understood. There is no knowledge to be gained. There is only recognizing what kind of question one is asking, to foreshadow a little bit. And I think what are we reaching in the famous analyses that Freud is conducting, right? In the red man, we reach these string of letters like red, that is a kind of primordial signifier at the root of his symptoms. Or with the wolf man, it's the letter V. And all of these primordial signifiers function just as such. They pose a question. They don't have a meaning. They are a question for meaning, to gather meaning. And that's why Lacan is basically saying, what is at issue for our subject is the question, what am I? Or am I? A relation of being, a fundamental signifier. It is to the extent that this question was aroused as symbolic and not reactivated as imaginary, that the decomposition of his neurosis was triggered and his symptoms became organized. So this is talking about the case he's analyzing there. Whatever their qualities, their nature, the material form which they are borrowed, his symptoms have the value of being a formulation, a reformulation, or even an insistence of this question. So there's at the root of the symptom, this primordial, this fundamental signifier, as he calls it. And from this, we derive lots of reformulations of this question, which are the symptoms. Like in the case of the Wolfman, this is super, super clear to me. And that's why I like to use this example. This V addresses something that he can't really name, that doesn't have a meaning, which in his case is sexuality. And Freud says this V at the root of all his symptoms, or the Roman 5, derives from the image of a woman spreading her legs. That's what he's saying. And this image becomes, through the letter V, a signifier, becomes to function as a fundamental signifier that asks for meaning, right? That represents nothing but the lack of another signifier. And then all these symptoms, like for example, the wolf, the 5th hour, or him having a dream about a wasp one time, or about a butterfly that looks like a V when spreading its wings, all kind of address this question or reformulate this question, trying to give meaning to it, but in essence only displacing it. Yeah, so this V in essence is a question, these primordial signifiers. And now my proposition is that this schema L can in essence be mapped onto the schema of the signifier I was proposing before. So why? So we have the primordial signifier in the beginning, which asks this question, what am I, right? Asking for another signifier. And then this other signifier arrives, fills in this lack, and the question is basically just displaced. For me, this represents or echoes the structure of the schema L, because what is happening is there is a choice of an object of desire, and this object of desire comes to carry the answer, right? So the question is displaced into an object of desire. The idea then is, if I will acquire this object of desire, I will thereby also acquire the answer to the question, who am I? And this object of desire also provides the subject with an identification, which basically is, what kind of person do I have to be to acquire this object, to desire this object? Yeah, Lacan basically says that in this way, the Freudian topography of the ego shows us how a hysteric or an obsessional uses his or her ego in order to raise the question that is precisely in order not to raise it. The structure of neurosis, of a neurosis, is essentially a question. And indeed, this is why for a long time it was for us purely and simply a question. Yeah, what question is that? That, of course, is the question, what is a woman? And this question becomes really clear in the case of Dora that he's mentioning. And I hope I can further exemplify my mapping of the signifier on the schema L with this case of Dora. So her primordial signifier is, of course, this cough of her father. And this cough is, in essence, a question because it relates to sexual diseases, because it relates to oral sex, right? And it's the question, what is a woman? In what sense? It is the question, what does my father desire, right? And that desire is, of course, the desire for a woman. But what is that woman? And then this question is displaced onto Frau K. So she has the answer what a woman is. That's why she becomes the object of desire. And then Frau K also provides her with a fitting ego because in her mind, first of all, in the beginning, in her mind, she has to be like Herr K to be desirable for Frau K or to desire Frau K. But if we go back to the chapter Imaginary Dissolution, Lacan says this whole structure crumbles. That's on page 91. When Herr K says, my wife is nothing to me. Why is that so important? It's important for multiple reasons, but it's important because she recognizes Herr K is not a sufficient ego identification for desiring Frau K or for acquiring Frau K as an object of desire, right? Because if Frau K is nothing, if Frau K is nothing for Herr K, that's not the way to be to get Frau K. And that's where the whole identification crashes, because also this displacement of the question doesn't function anymore. Yeah, so back to schema L, it would of course look like this. The cough is then the full speech that asks the question. There is in effect something radically unassimilable to the signifier. It's quite simply the subject's singular existence. Why is he here? Where has he come from? What is he doing here? Why is he going to disappear? The signifier is incapable of providing him with the answer for the good reason that it places him beyond death. The signifier already considers him dead. By nature, it immortalizes him. And that is basically the answer why the question is, what is a woman? And why the question of the hysteric always relates to sexuality, death, and procreation. In my opinion, it's a little bit like a chicken and an egg problem, because every signifying chain always has one, always produces the lack of a signifier, right? So this question always insists, and this is kind of his answer why it is connected always with these topics, because these topics are what the signifier cannot signify. Yeah, and procreation relates to what is a woman. Now, his critique of other kinds of psychoanalysis is basically that they only can look at this ego relation. And this is basically where the preconscious is located. And I think still it will take loads of work to uncover this identification and this object of desire. It took, Freud wasn't successful in uncovering that. It is definitely not conscious. Like Dora's identification with Herr K is not conscious. But still, this identification isn't what is important in analysis. Because what is important in analysis is the -1, which is always signified by this primordial signifier. The question is, why does she identify with Herr K? Because she displaced this question onto Frau K. And this displacement is unconscious, but the identification is preconscious. Yeah, and that's basically what he's criticizing. For them, for the other analysts, the ego is the prevailing framework of phenomena. Everything goes through the ego. Ego regression is the sole means of access to the unconscious. And that's what he doesn't agree with, because that's just the preconscious for him. And then the last thing I want to note, which I think was really interesting, were his observations about teaching and being understandable, right? He's basically saying that he is consciously doesn't want to be understood. And I was asking myself, well, why is that so? And the only answer I could find is basically that this axis of identification is also the axis of understanding, as I said before. And this is also the axis of understanding in teaching. Basically, you have your teacher, you have your master, and you think he has the answer, and you think you have to be a good student to learn the answer. And if we think back to how I mapped this on the signification schema, This is also where signification is created, so a certain content of something. But the content is not the only thing Lacan wants to transmit in his teaching. That's why he wants to be difficult to understand, because the unconscious is specifically a -1, a lack of content to be understood. That's why he says, this leads me to think, and that's Seminar 2, this leads me to think that the only genuine teaching is one which succeeds in awakening an insistence in those who are listening. This desire to know, which can only emerge when they themselves have taken the measure of ignorance as such, insofar as it is as such fruitful, and no less so on the part of the one who teaches. So basically the idea is you're not only communicating a content to be understood, but the unconscious is in some sense presented as the insistence of something that cannot be understood. And that's why he wants to give his listeners the chance to not quite understand, as he says. Yeah. That was my presentation.
That was really good. That was especially the breakdown of sign, trace, and signifier. Definitely have a lot of very, very positive feedback to that, because I think you were spot on pretty much all of it. I think one thing for the audience, as to clarification, on the schema L, you put object of desire. And so for everybody to know, that is not the same as the objet or object cause of desire. We're dealing with, what Freud will call object love or object cathexis. We should think of it like that for now, because we're not dealing with, objet, which represents more of like a remainder, an excess, or like that's when we get in the realm of surplus jouissance. But that will lead me into the importance of object of desire with the continuation of the presentation in section or chapter 13, part 2 of Hysteric's question, which is, what is a woman? So Lacan really centers this around the Oedipus complex, which is the major theme to this. But before he starts talking about this, he brings up something about the symbol or symbolism. And we should notice that, while the symbol does have its function, it's structured around the structure of language and what we've been talking about, the signifier, which is quite different from the symbol on its own, which we have to, as Lacan says, give thanks to Jungianism or Jung for, the invention of the symbol. The symbol to him is something analogous to the lotus flower, or a flower that blossoms from the depths of one's psychology, one's soul, and makes itself present or makes itself conscious. For the Jungians, it's the complex that makes itself conscious. And at the same time, we have witnessed this in the previous chapter, or I should say 2 chapters ago in 13, or I can't even count, 11, where he makes this point. Psychoanalysis does not intend to reorient the paradoxes of the ego and strengthen it into a way that's stable and healthy and conforms to society in a normative way, ego psychology. Nor is it to make something that is unconscious conscious on the level of thinking. This is the prime maxim of Jungianism or Jungian psychology, to make the unconscious conscious. We are not dealing with an unconscious that has depth. We could say that it's all surface. It comes up in the gaps of speech. It is this importance of the -1. It gives us a little thing. To read coffee grounds is to not read hieroglyphics. And the way I take that kind of has to deal with the function of letters and signs and how they refer to other signs. in this reading coffee grounds versus something that is sort of reference to itself in hieroglyphics, symbols that are kind of taken on their own, that they have their own depth and their own surface, their own meaning. This is totally different from what psychoanalysis is doing. I may have kind of probably misinterpreted that, but that's how I understand what he's getting at, because I don't really know where he's referenced this besides here. I've heard it before, but I don't know what exactly, if it's in the Cree somewhere or in another seminar that he actually goes into depth with what this is. Needless to say, there's something that you mentioned that I want to go over again, which is the function of, or the structure of neurosis. And he talks about Aristotle on thinking, the mind, and the soul. Man thinks with his soul. And Lacan says, well, in the same way, it's the neurotic that asks the question with his ego, the question that he really is not trying to ask. And so we get a sort of inverted form of the question. Well, what does this question have to do with? But it has to do with, for Dora at least, because that was what we were focusing on, what is a woman? Or the Hungarian patient of a case study who came from very adversities in his life and seemed just fine, and worked many jobs. And then he was a train conductor. He would punch tickets. And in one occasion, he fell out of the train and had an accident, hit his head, and went to the hospital, was all stitched up, and started to have these symptoms appear of chronic pains, pains on his side and his ribs, and they couldn't find any sort of trace of physical cause, right? And so he would just continue to kind of apply pressure on it, put some padding and even a pillow to rest to kind of make the pain go away, and then they would still continue to appear. Well, to go back to what you were saying on the difference between a natural sign, a trace, and the signifier, well, this is a prime example because, and this will lead me to talk about Oedipus, but this is another example of what psychoanalysis is dealing with this -1, or a signifier that does not refer to anything but another signifier, a signifier that tries to, take the place to signify the absence, of a signifier or any sort of referential meaning. This patient, or this Hungarian man, goes constantly to the doctors to see what this pain is coming from, and they find no trace of any physical symptoms, so they recommend him to psychoanalysis for chronic hysteric neurosis. And apparently this analyst was kind of, Pivian Freud. He was a sort of like almost an ego psychologist, maybe a Freudian revisionist. And all the symptoms come out. He's deep in analysis. And all of a sudden, in these moments of acting out, he stumbles upon the same problem that Freud himself stumbled upon with the Wolfman. And that is symptoms with no genetic or chronological origin, a cause. And so this was something that was transformative in Freud's theory of understanding neurosis, and going from what I talked about before, from looking at the psychic apparatus from a genetic one to a topological or a topographical one. And so it is on the level of this absence of any sort of natural sign or natural cause, or to be more technical in this seminar, I think it's like anal stage, the anal stage development. This flies in the face of the traditional way of looking at like the sort of oral, anal, phallic, and all these that are sort of like not just formal, but lie onto a sort of developmental, localizable, evolutionary trait. And so what this has to do with is the fact that in the absence of this is where we see the structure of the -1, in that really retroactively what caused these symptoms is something that can't be traced to a localizable origin, but something that is structural on fantasy and this hysteric question of, am I a man who is able to procreate? And so retroactively, through the function of not only memory, and which we'll talk about, but of fantasy, which has its basis on the background of memory, we're dealing with this fantasy of pregnancy, a pregnancy fantasy of wanting to deliver or give birth. And memory occurs in this patient apparently of when he was a little boy. He witnessed, like, I believe it was his neighbor from, he was sneaking around and playing around and being a kid, and his neighbor from, he had seen his neighbor from the window giving birth, but it ended up being a stillbirth, and the baby being carried away in like a body bag, pretty much, or the doctor carrying it away. They didn't have any trauma or anything, but what remained is the sort of, I guess, fantasy that takes a that is filling the place of the absence of being able to signify that moment. But don't get confused. This is not to say that this was the cause of his trauma, but what we get is the play of the reenactment of a pregnancy fantasy that structures around this hysteric question, that structures his hysteria of, am I somebody who is capable of procreation in society? And so all these things of acting out, of falling out of the train, and the symptoms are sparking right there. That is the fulfillment of his wish fulfillment to deliver. He was delivered right there, as Lacan kind of plays on. So what does that have to do with what I was building up to in Oedipus, right? Well, the same thing of the signifier and absence comes up here with Dora and of Oedipus complexes. So we all know that the Oedipus complex, for lack of a better term, is when the boy has, a love for the mother and hate or rivalry with the father, and vice versa. So Laplanche and Pontalis in psychoanalysis, the language of psychoanalysis, define this aspect. It's a truism. It's kind of cliche, but it is, in a sense, like the sort of foundation of Freud's, early understanding of the Oedipus complex. That would be the positive Oedipus complex, in which you have, the child in rivalry with the same sex, and desiring, the object of desire would be the parent of the opposite sex. So for the boy, they invest all their love into the mother and have rivalry with the father. And then the negative Oedipus complex would be that of having identification and love for the same sex, and rivalry for the opposite sex. But that is sort of a digression. What we're dealing with right here, again, is something that is not based upon a historical event that happened in the child's past. Rather, it is something that is prescriptive for psychoanalysis to deal with these fundamental fantasies that are linked up within prohibition and law, rather than one of fundamental need and satisfaction on a biological level. This is coming from Laplanche and Pontalis, but I think this goes quite well because with Lacan, because what we're dealing with is something that happens from what he has talked about since the beginning of Seminar 3, with, if this function, if we were just simply operating on the imaginary, we would be like bumper cars hitting each other. So what we have is the name of the father that is able to instill itself and act as a barrier from imaginary egos just constantly aggressively hitting each other. So this name of the father has a relationship to the signifier, this father function, who also carries something that's consubstantial with it, and that would be the phallus. So phallic function, right, as he describes it in Oedipus complex, has a sort of gestalt lure to it. And so the importance of this is that for Freud, he noticed that there's a dissymmetry between the Oedipus complex in boys, little boys, and little girls. We see in the boys a maneuver and order of operation, which, as I said earlier, they grow fond affection and love for the mother that becomes their sort of object choice, and a rivalry with the father that sort of keeps them from obtaining it in which would be called the prohibition of incest. The father keeps that from happening, so there is this sort of imaginary rivalry between the father and the child. And there has to be a resolution to this to obtain what would be an object love, an ideal, right? We're speaking of it in a perfect world. But this Oedipus complex on its own will just become an endless rivalry. So what stops that is the castration complex. So what we have is the castration complex, what stops that and is indicative of male sexuality. And I'll get back more into this to that. The interesting thing that Laplanche says that Freud discovers is that in this dissymmetry, we have immediate identification with the father on the level of the little girl versus object cathexis, object investment, and then identification. We have immediate identification. And it's with the father. Lacan will kind of build up upon this further. But why this happens is because rather than rivalry being the main strategy of the little girl, like it is for the little boy, it is extreme identification because castration complex drives the little girl towards that versus the boy who wants object love or the primary love of the mother, but can't because of the rivalry. And in the heat of the rivalry, we get castration. So castration already is what's driving the little girl to identify with the father. But what is the little girl identifying with the father with? But the phallus itself, right? And Lacan says right here in 176, if for the girl, as much as for the boy, the castration complex assumes a pivotal value in bringing about the Oedipus complex. It does so precisely as a function of the father, because the phallus is a symbol to which there is no correspondent, no equivalent. It's a matter of dissymmetry in the signifier. The signifying dissymmetry determines the paths down which the Oedipus complex will pass. The two paths make them both pass down the same trail, the trail of castration. And this castration we've always seen as like a sort of minus phi. It has to deal with loss. And with loss, we get repression. And we see repression operate differently on the level of the boy and the girl. And we should think of this boy and girl as synonymous with hysteria versus obsession, these two different choices of neurosis. And so this is why when you get this fear of castration, even though it's already operative in the boy, is the sort of imaginary rivalry and mastery with the analysis to avoid this anxiety of the question at stake in the neurosis is, am I alive or am I dead? But for the woman, it has to deal with everything that can't be signified because there, as Lacan says, if there is a symbolic structuration of women's sexuality and symbolic order, it is that of a void, right? Because this phallus, if it's a symbol, it's not a natural symbol. It's not a Jungian symbol. It's like an index, as Michael Downs of The Dangerous maybe puts in his blog on the phallus. It's sort of indexical, like in the way of a smoke machine, it produces smoke, but it doesn't indicate a fire. It's like a simulation in a sense. And so for the man, it's like to obtain this would obtain, not only, the sense of like being alive, but also like of mastery of what the other has, the other's enjoyment. And for the woman, it's identifying with this object because it situates themselves as woman, but it's also an impossibility because there is no symbolic way that it situates woman. Rather, it's a sort of imaginary identification. And it's in the failure of this imaginary identification, as we see in, as you pointed out, in Dora with, all right, as he says, this object of desire is Frauke, but only on the fact that it has relation to Herke. And so Herke brings about the specular allure, the ego, the mirror stage ego, and then the reality testing of that and what would be the imaginarized, of that object of desire is Frauke, right? But on the basis that there's something that she wants to know of what it is to be a woman because it has everything to do with her father, whose desire still remains mysterious, that it has to do with Frauke, but what is it that, and what is it to be a woman? And so when this sort of quadruplicity, as you've perfectly mapped out, not only here but also in one of the past lectures, what was it where he talks about Dora first? It's imaginary dissolution, right?
Yeah.
You talk about the quadruplicity of relations that Dora is put in. Um, this sort of imaginary specular thing um, destroys itself, and so the question of the symbolic remains on the level of the unconscious on this thing. And so why Lacan wants to talk about Oedipus complex is this is, and with the phallus, what makes sexuality possible. This dissymmetry, which does not relate to anything natural or traces back to anything natural, nor does the symptom, which relates to this fantasy of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a person that is able to procreate, but rather something that fills in, in the gaps of, you could say, the unconscious, or the gaps of speech, which is the unconscious. This fantasy, this question that the neurotic has, that's what is, and it's not something that has to deal with a real life event in the past, just like Oedipus complex. This is not a narrative that has to deal with something that happened in the subject's actual lived history, but something that operates on the basis of memory. And so far, memory is artificially constructing phantasmatic scenes. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that is pretty much what I
think it's so important, the last thing, because that's always what Freud is struggling with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this now a real event, or is that like a retroactive fantasy of something? Like with the Wolfman, it's all the time about the question if this event really happened, with seeing his parents, the Urscene, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everything, and that also relates, I think, to the topic of misunderstanding the unconscious as a content. It's not a content. Yeah. It's not, as you said, like I like the way you said that like it's not that this train conductor seeing the birth, right? Mm-hmm. That is not the essence of it, right? It's not that is not the thing that is repressed. What is really the unconscious is the fact that this seeing the scene is a question, is the signifier of a question that he cannot answer.
Yeah.
It's the -1, like the unanswered question, that is really the unconscious.
Yeah.
I think that's what many people get wrong. Or
Right. No,
I think
yeah.
that talking about all the time, talking about sex and death and so on, makes people think that the unconscious is just, oh, I don't want to see that, you know, I don't
Mhm.
want to think about death.
Mhm.
But that's not what it's about. It's just
Yeah.
that death is something that the signifier cannot signify, at least
Yeah.
that's the way
Yeah.
it
And it's
works.
like, when you look on the level of like film and stuff like that, like people do want to still desire to see it and put themselves in a sort of neutral gaze, whether it's like horror movies or pornography. If you take the sort of Baudrillardian approach of like the obscenity, it's like you're being saturated with all this fast-paced, in-depth imagery that stultifies you from the question of death or sex, because it's the fact of what is it, and that's what is sort of unnameable or unanswerable
Yeah,
for
it's not that it is something. It's
yeah,
that we're not sure about what it is.
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Horror is not something, but that we
yeah.
don't know what it is, or that it is like an unanswerable question. But talking about movies, I recently watched a movie called Cat on the Hot Tin Roof. I don't know if you know that film.
No, no, no.
It's with Elizabeth Taylor, and it's basically like a guy who is an alcoholic, and
Hmm.
he doesn't talk to his father, and then his father confronts him about why he's an alcoholic, and that
Mm,
leads to a really long conversation until they are in the cellar. They are literally in the cellar, right, of the
yeah.
house, and underground, where the repressed stuff is. And then he says, like, basically, yeah, you never loved me, father, you know.
Mm,
And then that is the thing that had to be said, right? Oh no,
yeah.
it's the repressed thing. But that's not what it's about. It's not that it's a content that you couldn't talk about or something.
Hmm.
It's about an unanswered
The
question.
and yeah, the unanswered, the and the absence. So like it must take form with another signifier. And so if you, as like you pointed out in your lecture for chapter 12, the importance of distinguishing the unconscious from the preconscious, because there's always this sort of confusion of like, the relationship between unconscious and preconscious. And I mean, well, a lot of the preconscious is stuff that we could, become more aware of from, dreams or talking about it more, or certain day residues. But at the same time, there's stuff that ultimately have a knowledge to it. And it's this, as you pointed out, psychoanalysis reveals this non-knowledge. And this is kind of like a precursor as what he when he gets into his discourse theory. It is a not this minus one is a non-knowledge, not in the sense that it's like anti-philosophy or non-philosophy in the was it Laruelle sense, but that this transmission of the letter or the signifier is not like a discourse of mastery of like what all discourses hitherto have been, the university discourse, which is pretty much the discourse that has, if we talk about historically, has been the dominant mode. It's just retroactively we could see how on the elementary or fundamental aspect um, of discourse, it's not power like Foucault, but rather it is one of enjoyment, of the other's enjoyment. And that's what mastery is. So the relationship of this knowledge and what makes discourse possible is of jouissance. Of course, he's not talking about that, but we could kind of add into why we could see this as non-knowledge, because it's something that relates to the structure and subjectivity of the neurosis, the compulsion to repeat, and something that only has an efficacy in analysis because of the transference, what comes up in full speech, which is the discourse of the unconscious, which is not like it's full of meaning, rather, it's full of analytical work. We could say that. And that it breaks the rupture of the imaginary wall, which is empty speech, this understanding or reconnaissance.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like that you mentioned mathemes, right? Mathemes. as this discourse in Lacan, because I think they are like the ultimate form of non-knowledge, right?
Yeah.
And I read this text by Lacan where he basically said, yeah, the end of analysis is, it's called the sophist's question. It's a really nice short text. And he talks about la langue and matheme. And he basically says the end of analysis is a passage, right, of something that is an absence, a
Mhm.
kind of non-knowledge, and that is a matheme. Right?
Yeah.
I think pretty much like this
Right.
letter V, for example, of the Wolfman, is like a matheme, because
Yeah.
it literally formalizes his impossibly to resolve question.
Yeah.
And from that, then all the material of the symptom is chosen. Yeah, but I wanted to ask something else. I can't really find this quote, but he basically says the way the man relates to the Oedipus complex is more complex, more complex. It takes a detour, something like that. He says that, whereas the female is less complicated. It doesn't take a detour.
Well,
And
it was actually the other way around.
oh, really?
Yeah, it's really she takes the detour via identification with the father rather than cathexing on the object love, as is what's happening with the boy, which again would be the mother, and then thus enters into this rivalry, imaginary rivalry with the imaginary father. What we get is identification with the imaginary father insofar as that this like this lost object trying to be sort of the phallus for the father. And in Freud, um, it's as Laplanche says, it's like uh as he says right here, um, where is it at? That pretty much the what this sort of fantasy structure of identifying with the father is an attempt of compensation. She slips along the lines of a symbolic equation, one might say, from the penis to a baby, rather than something that could be on the level of like what makes a man symbolically. Well, it's a symbolic articulation or articulation of um, the penis, even though the phallus is not the penis.
Mm.
Um, you know, when put into question of like, male sexuality, it's always, like on a measurement of like what, what one does with their penis or whatever, or like, uh, and it's never just the penis, but rather like, what you see in rap music, like they're like, dick references are always like reference to something even bigger than that. But it's like, that sort of like metaphor or analogy. Whereas like for this, it's like identifying with the phallus, or not identifying with the penis, but rather um this notion of the baby is the fact that the girl can bring something desirable to the father. And so it's like if we put this in the cliche heteronormative terms, it's like the woman when she finds her lover by identifying with this father's lost object, it's bringing the child to the man, which would make her all, which would make her desirable, right? And this has to still do with even what goes on in the Hungarian male patient of, am I somebody that's able to procreate in society? There is a relation to that because it's like, well, what is a woman if it can't be identified with you know purely the female organ? There's sort of something more to it, and I think maybe that takes the place in Dora because of the um, retroactive formulation of the encounter of fellatio, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's just probably because of like the crude Victorian era. Like I don't know if fellatio was illegal back then, or or was that associated with like uh syphilis or like STDs, right? And so it's like in that time, Even if that is like a sort of like culturally relative thing of the time, it's not dated in the sense that, something is always out of place in the symbolic. Whether the content, it's like the form is still the same. Something that still cannot be equated on the level of what is desirable, especially for the woman. Like no matter how much you count of certain things, on the level of woman, it's like it can't become all or totalizable for what could be, symbolically articulated as feminine sexuality. And so it's like she's caught in that gap and that void of what woman is.
It's definitely related to STDs because uh, so this father's cough, he is coughing because he has an STD.
Oh,
But
okay.
this coughing also relates to fellatio, and
Yeah.
fellatio again relates to the fact that he has an STD,
Yeah.
which like Dora is asking himself, asking herself, if my father has an STD, how can he have sex with this Frau K, right?
Yeah.
Answer is fellatio,
Right.
which I don't really know what they mean. Like if he's impotent or if he cannot get an erection and how that relates, I don't know. But that's just
Mhm.
what Freud is saying. Like he's saying she thinks about her father involved in fellatio, and
Mhm.
this relates to his cough, which relates to a STD, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But in this identification, the strange thing is she's simultaneously identifying with her father because he
Mhm.
is coughing.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, she's identifying with Frau K, right?
Yeah.
And then Freud says something so funny. He's like, yeah, it's this tingle in the back of my throat, right? So
Mhm.
she's imagining him herself in the act of fellatio with her
Mhm.
father, basically.
Right. Right. No.
Man, Freud is so entertaining. Anyways,
Yeah.
like the thing is, I think it's a little bit misleading everything he's saying in these two chapters in the sense that it's not really that just the question is what is a woman? It can be that question, right? But it doesn't have to be for everyone.
Mhm.
It's just these questions always relate to sexuality or to the other
Right.
sex or to death
Yeah.
and all these things that don't find their place in the signifying order.
Yeah.
Um,
And so pretty much like with the obsession versus like the hysteric, it's like for the hysteric, who am I for the other? And
yeah,
it's like not the imaginary other, but like the big other, the fundamentally the big other. And for the obsessional, it doesn't necessarily have to do with life or death, but on a sense, uh, mastery and mutual recognition, which is also impossible. As Lacan will say in Seminar 1 and a bit into that this like when he places like the rivalry of the obsession as like the Kojevian master slave dialectic, mutual recognition, which is impossible. Yeah, that's what we could see that like um those two different modes of neurosis applied to. Yeah,
yeah,
because it's a good
yeah.
point. It's like it doesn't necessarily have to be like, am I a man or a woman, or am I alive or am I dead? It can be, and some of those themes can take place in especially the wish fulfillment of the dream, or a fantasy. But really, it's like the thing is was one is like on mastery, and the other one is on like who am I for the other.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that because like I feel like many people critique psychoanalysis by saying they have too many ready-made answers, right?
Mhm.
And they just listen to the patient until they hear something that fits to the answers they already made up.
Mhm.
They have already made up their mind about what the unconscious is and what the reason
Right.
for the symptom is. But
Right.
I recently read a text by Lacan on like the transmission of psychoanalysis and on la passé, right? And
Yeah.
he was basically saying psychoanalysis, every analysis is a new invention of psychoanalysis.
Yeah. I've
Uh,
heard that one.
because what is a woman? I mean, why? How does it relate to the Oedipus complex? It relates to the Oedipus complex in the sense of castration, right?
Mhm.
What is a woman is the question, what does it mean to be castrated, right? What does that
Yeah.
mean that there's this absence?
Yeah.
Also, this is already some kind of analogy, because what does it mean that there's this absence is also the question, what is the meaning of the symbolic -1, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I kind of understood a little bit what he was saying is that a woman, so men and women both ask themselves that question. What is this -1? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be castrated? But for a man, this woman is more externalized. So
Mhm.
it's he's also saying in the beginning something like it's very not so often that there is a man who is hysteric, right? More
Mhm.
often they're neurotic. But I was understanding that he was trying to say that for a man, he's asking himself also, what is it to be a man?
Yeah.
That question is equivalent to the question, what is not a man? That means
Yeah.
woman. So the
Yeah.
woman is more
That,
outside. The castration
yeah.
is outside, right?
Yep.
At least you're fooling yourself about that.
Yeah. And it goes back to like the end of the logical time essay where he says like those three, like I think those three statements, I know not what a man is. I only know what man is among other men. In the fear of not being a man, I declare myself a man. So it's like there's this like anticipation and anxiety of being like cut off. So you declare yourself that off a sort of sophism. And I think the sophism would be, if we were to like apply this to that, would be that it's like, well, I'm not woman, I'm like, as if you could like deduce what that even is to
Yeah,
begin with in relation
yeah,
to you.
exactly.
you know
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And to me, that's exactly that displacement that I was trying
yeah,
to show that, like, oh, one signifier is another one, bam, but still there's a dissymmetry. Still there's this lag. It just has been displaced outside, right? And for a woman, it's more like inside. It
hmm,
has not been displaced because you are castrated, but still the
yeah,
question is there. Just you are the
yeah.
question.
Well, and then that's why it's like he makes these like, and I think this is where it's like it's helpful to really like read the seminars and not take these sort of statements out of context where like he'll say
Yeah.
uh woman is man's symptom. It's like, well, now it makes sense if we're understanding, the how the signifier works in the phallus, but like this signifier of presence and absence, and on differentiation between other signs rather than it having its own referent. It's always differentiating itself with another sign to
That's
replace the
why,
absent.
like, when people say Lacan is phallocentric, well, yes, he uses that word, right,
Yeah,
all the time. But do you know what that means?
yeah,
Why is
right.
how does that function, the phallus?
Yeah, and that would be like, if he, because he talks about Descartes a lot, calling him a Cartesian, and that, like, oh, he's just going back to the cogito, which is actually a real accusation that somebody made, which was so dumb.
I mean, kind of, he's going back
Yeah,
to Descartes, but
yeah,
Descartes minus cogito, basically.
yeah, pretty much.
It's
Yeah,
like he's also, I mean, the signifier is kind of like this doubt, right, going on all the time,
yeah,
but there's no
yeah,
reification of who is doubting. There is the thing
yeah,
that
yeah, and
doubts. And, yeah.
yeah. And it's rather, it's like, yeah, it's not a reification of like the I think, but rather it's like reflexivity, as he says in Seminar 2, is the process of the unconscious. Because it's like, well, you have the battery of signifiers, which we could say as if it is S, or just signifiers that get deferred onto by the -1, is on the level of the preconscious, and they retroactively have to account for itself on this -1, the unconscious, which is the subject, right? We're talking
Yeah.
about the subject. It's not only just the counting of one or two one, but also accounting for, the process.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I was thinking about like this funny way of like explaining like the or illustrating like the logic of like how counting and the signifier and the subject of the unconscious operate, where it's like if like there's somebody who like tries to count every grain of sand on the beach,
Mhm.
it's impossible, not because they're just going to be there forever counting one each time, but it's impossible because they're always going to go back to the start of one because they might have missed a step in the process. You know?
Yeah, yeah. I think we got it, no?
Yeah, I think so. That was a really good one, a really good presentation. I think,
Looking forward to the next one.
yeah, definitely.
Signifier as such signifies nothing.
Which, yeah, I think he really builds that off, especially with like understanding the distinction between um the natural sign, the trace, and then the signifier, which is like it's important to understand that there's no referent, like because each like the first two have referent, even if like the referent is absent, it still can be found, right? If I'm not mistaken,
Yeah, yeah,
for the trace,
yeah.
but
Like
it's like
Robinson Crusoe, he
yeah,
encounters the guy who
yeah,
races. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I just
But
want to mention one last thing about why he's actually um, talking about a woman so much, right? Because we shouldn't forget that all of this is about our boy
Schraber,
Raber, yes, and he also
yeah,
wants to be a woman. No, he doesn't want
mm,
to, but he's dealing with the issue of being castrated, right?
yeah.
And I think he talks about all of this just to show how it is not like Schreber, right?
Yes, that is correct. Because at one point you have this delusional imagination of what it would be like to be a woman and to be, fucked by God, but then also this like sort of uh destiny to be with God and procreate uh and create the entire world again. But then also this impossibility of being castrated, which is why he rejects the signifier. And when you look at all these like his history, it's like the inability to meet the demands of what it would be to be a man, you know,
Yeah,
uh probably all the stuff that you witnessed by being in the fraternity of Cassiopeia, whether it had to do with like hazing and homoerotic, hazings that display one's manliness, the inability to have kids, and then when he becomes president, the highest position ever, it's like when it all just collapses down. Um,
yeah, and
and
I mean the difference between him and all the cases we are looking at is that this Hungarian man and Dora, both of them have internalized the primordial signifier, right? They have accepted,
yeah.
and they are trying to answer its question through.
Yeah, because there is a knowledge that lies beneath it, and the knowledge is the question itself. Whereas,
Exactly. Yeah.
as he says in 11, with Verwerfung, it's like there is this unwillingness to want to know to begin with. They don't
Yeah.
want to know the knowledge of castration, so they just fully reject it. And so it always comes by in the real or back in the real as something which destabilizes the delusion. Not that the delusion was stable to begin with, but it breaks into the like sort of barriers of the delusion as a hallucination. Very painful, but will seem like it's something that is like unexplainable for Schraber. Like these voices, the rays, that is the signifier in the real that comes back.
Yeah, because I'm curious to see how he will deal with this, because before that it was just like suggested that the
Right.
signifier that comes from the outside has to do something with castration, and that means feminizing him in some sense.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
we'll see who deals with that, right?
Yeah. That was a good episode. So
Yes, this was really
thank
fun.
you for a wonderful presentation as always, Max, with the amazing PowerPoints. And thank you all for watching this one. We'll be back at it again with another banger on what was it, Lecture 14, right?
Yeah.